Hey, what's up, y'all? It's D about to react to this video by Blackie Speaks. His title, The David case just entered a new phase. Finally. Is he getting arrested? What the hell is happening? Let's see what's going on. Let's watch.
Now, over the last few months, the David spelled d4vd case has moved through a lot of different stages. At first, it was intense online speculation about what really happened to 14-year-old Celeste, with constant discussion and headlines coming at us fast. Then it shifted into something more serious: suspect status, sealed records, law enforcement signaling accountability. And after that, things seemed to quiet down, at least publicly. But quiet doesn't mean nothing is happening, because there's been movement behind the scenes. A key witness connected to the investigation was taken into custody before later posting bail. A witness who also happens to be a social media influencer frequently photographed with David. At the same time, family members are fighting court orders tied to the case. And then there's the Tesla, because something has shifted there as well. Ownership of the car has changed, and new questions are now being raised about what evidence may or may have not been preserved. But here's the part that changes everything. Newly unsealed court documents now describe David as the target in a Los Angeles County grand jury investigation tied to Celeste's death. Not a person of interest, target. The filings state he may have committed a criminal offense in California, which is of course where this heinous crime against this little girl happened. And in these filings, they specifically reference one count of murder, and this is pulled directly from the court documents for this case. David hasn't been arrested or charged in a crime yet. However, when prosecutors label someone a target inside a grand jury proceeding, that tells you where the investigation is pointing. When you take a step back and look at everything together, this no longer feels like the same chapter we were in a few months ago. It feels like a transition. It feels like the case has entered a new phase. But what exactly does that new phase mean for the investigation and for David himself? Now, it's almost been 3 months since we last talked about this story. Crazy how fast time flies. At the time, the case felt like it had reached a peak. Suspect status, autopsy records sealed, law enforcement publicly, signaling accountability. There were a lot of things we covered. But since then, even though things seemed quiet on the surface, there have been subtle shifts happening behind the scenes. Before we dive deeper into what this new phase means, let's go back to where we left off, because that context, of course, matters. In the last video we made, we discussed how investigators had labeled him a suspect. That information came from a source with direct knowledge of the investigation, and from that same report, we also learned that David was not cooperating with law enforcement at that point in time. We also talked about law enforcement sources indicating that investigators believe more than one person may have been involved in what was done to Celeste, and that was a major shift in the tone of the case. At that point, it didn't feel like this was about just one person anymore. It feels like investigators were widening the net, trying to understand whether responsibility extended beyond a single individual. And the question, of course, naturally became, who else was there? Who crossed paths with Celeste before this? Who might have known something connected to that as well? We learned that the timeline itself may have been a very different one from what people originally assumed. A law enforcement source stated that Celeste may have been deceased for months, dating back to the spring of 2025, even though her remains weren't discovered until September 2025. So that gap raised a lot of questions, because we still don't have clear answers about what happened during that period of time. And honestly, that part of the case was one of the most difficult pieces to process. I mean, we're talking about a gap of months. That's not a small window. That's an entire stretch of time where something happened, and we still don't fully understand what. We also talked about these sealed autopsy records. As some of you might remember, the LAPD went to a judge and successfully obtained a court order to seal everything connected to Celeste's autopsy. That included the cause of death, the manner of death, the autopsy findings, physical evidence, essentially the entire file. Now, according to the detective behind that request, the reason was to protect the integrity of the investigation, especially given how high profile the case had become. He also stated that releasing those details could expose witnesses or informants who are cooperating with law enforcement in the case. And most importantly, investigators formally described this as a murder investigation. Now, given the circumstances, we already knew that, right? But this was the first time it was officially put on record. So that's where things stood at the time, and that's what we last covered in the video that I made. There are a lot of heavy developments, strong signals from investigators, and then silence. But silence doesn't always mean stagnation, because over the past few weeks, things have happened that suggest this case isn't sitting still at all. Let's start with what happened on January 23rd, just a few weeks ago. It begins with a social media influencer by the name of Neil Langston, someone who's been photographed around David over the past year, and who had already been identified as a key grand jury witness in this investigation. From what's publicly visible, they appear to be friends. How close exactly are they? We don't really know the details. At least they're close enough to take this photo together where David's shirt says, "Sounds gay?" And why is old boy smiling in his mugshot like that? I have a lot of questions. But what we do know is this. In late January, Langston was arrested in Montana, and that's because he had an out-of-state warrant after failing to appear as a witness in Los Angeles. So basically, he was expected to show up and testify in this case, and he didn't for whatever reason. County jail records show he was taken into custody on January 22nd. Shortly after, the Los Angeles Times confirmed that a judge had issued the warrant after he repeatedly declined to testify before the grand jury. Neil was eventually transported back to Los Angeles and released on a $60,000 bond. Now, grand jury proceedings are confidential, so we don't really know what was ultimately discussed or whether he testified once he returned. But here's the key part that stands out to me, at least. Grand juries don't usually issue out-of-state warrants unless testimony is considered important. Basically, they don't go through the process of tracking someone down across state lines unless they believe that person has information they need. Now, that doesn't automatically mean involvement. It could mean timeline, context, communication, movement, something he saw, something he heard, perhaps. I mean, they were friends after all, or possibly more than friends, according to some of his fans on Reddit. But the fact that the court wanted his appearance tells you his testimony mattered to some extent. And that's the piece I'm most curious about. Why? In early February, just a few weeks ago, TMZ published a clip showing Neil Langston walking into court in connection with the Celeste Rivas investigation.
Do you think David is innocent?
Again, that footage doesn't tell us what was said inside the courtroom, but it does confirm that this process is actively unfolding. Obviously, we don't know what his level of involvement is here, or even if there's one beyond just being called as a witness. But what we do know from previous reports is that investigators were bringing in multiple witnesses as part of this entire case and process. And here's the thing, right? When someone operates at the level that David was, especially in the music industry, since there were a lot of people around him, managers, friends, tour staff, collaborators, etc., there could have been people who saw some things. So the fact that witnesses are being called isn't so strange, and it also doesn't automatically mean guilt. It does, however, mean investigators are building context. Now, a lot of people did question why he initially declined to testify, and I'm very curious about that as well. But the reality is there's a lot of reasons why someone might hesitate in a situation like this, whether it's legal advice, fear of saying the wrong thing, or simply not wanting to be dragged into something this serious, whatever. Now, the witness situation wasn't the only thing that happened, because around that same time, this investigation extended itself into David's actual family. According to the Los Angeles Times, his father, mother, and brother, who all live in Texas, were served grand jury subpoenas tied to this investigation. So basically, California prosecutors want them to testify in this case. But instead of just going along with it, the family pushed back. They went to court in Texas and argued that forcing them to testify in California would violate their due process rights, meaning, in simple terms, they were challenging whether the legal procedure was being handled correctly in their case. However, that challenge didn't change much, because on February 9th, the court actually denied it. So as far as we know, they're still expected to show up and testify. And I'm not gonna lie, when I saw that his immediate family was being pulled into all this, it made me pause for a second, because you don't usually see investigators bring in parents and siblings this early in the process. Now, later on during, let's say, a trial, sure, you might see family testify about someone's character, who they are, their upbringing, things like that. But this isn't that. This is still the investigative phase. And when the immediate family is being brought in at this stage, it usually means investigators believe there's something relevant here, whether that's timeline clarification, communication records, travel details, financial movement, whatever it may be. Again, that doesn't mean wrongdoing, but it does mean that they think there's information in that circle that matters to the case. And when an investigation starts expanding outward like that, from friends to family, that's usually a sign that they're trying to map the full environment around a person. Not just what happened, but who knew what and when things actually happened. And that's the part that stands out, at least to me. Through all this, by the way, it's important to remember what this case is actually about. A 14-year-old girl, not a grown woman like a lot of these irresponsible platforms are saying, a 14-year-old little girl, a child, lost her life.
Calling her a grown woman?
All this. So just keep that in mind as we go through these details. Now, outside of the official court documents and mainstream news reports, there have also been independent updates coming from a private investigator who's been digging into this case on his own. And what he uncovered has to do with the Tesla, the very car where Celeste was found. On its own, it may not seem all that significant, but when you place that next to David now being described as a target in this investigation, that information, I believe, deserves some attention. So let's take a closer look at what's going on with the Tesla. So the private investigator's name is Steve Fisher, and we've talked about some of his findings before. Now, in late January, he posted something that caught my attention. Now, according to Steve, who did some investigative work, the car was only held by the LAPD for about 48 hours for evidence processing. Now, he says that it was released around September 10th, just 2 days after discovery, and then sent back to the impound lot. To support that claim, he shared what he described as a release receipt, showing the vehicle was cleared and available for pickup around that exact date, which, if accurate, suggests that from that point forward, the car was no longer being held as active evidence. It was sitting in storage, and that timeline matters, because if the vehicle was released on September 10th, that would mean it was no longer in police custody before Celeste had even been publicly identified. And I'm not gonna lie, that's where I kind of pause. Not as an accusation, just as a timing question. Because usually when a vehicle is directly tied to an active homicide investigation, especially one that's being presented to a grand jury, you'd expect it to remain secured for as long as investigators think they might need it. Now, that doesn't automatically mean 48 hours is not enough time to process any evidence they might find, because if forensic processing was completed thoroughly, they can, of course, release property. But without clarity on what was collected and documented in that window, the timing naturally stands out, at least to me. Now, this is of concern to me because for anyone who doesn't remember, Celeste was identified on September 16, 2025, roughly a week after her remains were discovered. So while the public was still trying to understand who she was, the vehicle connected to her their death was already out of police custody, according to Steve Fisher, who provided receipts. And according to Steve, the car also sat in storage for months, accumulating roughly $10,000 in fees. It was eventually scheduled to go to auction, meaning if no one stepped in, the vehicle would have been sold off. But then something interesting happened. In the final hours before that auction, somebody came and picked it up. Not weeks before, not even days before, hours. So it either had to be David himself, which would seem unlikely given everything going on, or someone legally authorized to act on his behalf. And once again, the timing, of course, matters. This was the car that Celeste was found in. This was a vehicle that had already been processed, released, sitting in storage, accumulating fees, and right before it goes public, somebody comes and picks it up. And then came a follow-up to this particular information. According to Steve, the vehicle wasn't just retrieved. Ownership was apparently transferred. Steve stated that someone presented paperwork and legally took possession and moved the car out of David's name. He claims to have verified that through DMV records. Now again, this information comes from a private investigator's public statements, not the LAPD. But if that sequence of information is all accurate, that's where a lot of questions come in. If a vehicle is central to a murder investigation, what's standard protocol? How long is evidence typically retained? Is there a minimum hold period in high-profile cases like this? Or does it simply depend on whether forensic processing is completed? And is 48 hours typical? Because a vehicle isn't just one piece of evidence, it's a contained environment. Because here's the thing, this right here isn't just a car. This was the last known physical space connected to a 14-year-old girl whose death is being investigated as a murder. So when you really think about that, fingerprints, DNA swabs, trace fibers, digital system data, especially in a Tesla, location history, can all of that realistically be processed, documented, and preserved only within 48 hours? I guess law enforcement would know more than me, right? Maybe if the authorities prioritized this case and moved very quickly, it's of course possible. But we've also seen other major cases, like the YNW Melly case, where the vehicle the rapper was in became a major forensic battleground and remained central evidence for an extended period of time. I'm not saying the cases are the same, of course not. I'm saying when a vehicle is central to a murder investigation, people naturally expect thorough preservation. And the LAPD hasn't publicly detailed what was collected, when it was collected, or why the timeline made sense. So what we're left with is this sequence: discovery, 2 days later, release, months in storage, auction scheduled, last minute retrieval, ownership transfer. When you line it up like that, it's hard not to ask questions. And again, I'm not jumping to conclusions. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I am just asking questions. I'm simply acknowledging that when you line these events up, the timing stands out. And in cases like this, timing, of course, matters. Because while the Tesla timeline is still being questioned, which has not been formally addressed by law enforcement yet, something major just became public. Newly unsealed court.
It just doesn't seem like they're handling this case correctly, and then it just makes you think, is someone being paid off to sabotage shit? You know, you just never know.
Documents now describe David, by his real name, David Burke, as the target of a Los Angeles County grand jury investigation tied to Celeste's death. Now, that was the word used in these documents. Target. And in grand jury language, that word carries weight. It usually means prosecutors believe they have strong evidence connecting that person to the alleged crime. Now, the documents go even further. They say he may have committed a criminal offense in California, specifically one count of murder. Now, pause there for a second, because up until now, this case has been very quiet publicly, and we've been sitting with that silence without any real confirmation.
That's what just doesn't make sense to me, because it's like Target, but this shit is just taking forever despite all of the evidence that they have. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. And I know these things take time, it doesn't happen overnight, but if he's the main person of interest in the target, like, why isn't things being moved along quicker and he's not locked up?
About where David stands out for us. Here's some further context. The reason why these documents surfaced is because of the legal fight involving his parents and brother that I told you about earlier, the same family members who were ordered to appear before the grand jury. And through those documents, we also learned more about what it looked like when they found Celeste's body in the Tesla. When police opened the front trunk of the Tesla on September 8th, 2025, after a worker reported a strong smell coming from the vehicle, they found a black cadaver bag inside, which is essentially another word for a body bag. Inside that bag were Celeste's remains. Police partially unzipped it and found a decomposed head and torso. There was also a second bag underneath the first one, which contained the rest of her dismembered body parts. This is all in the court documents, and the details are obviously extremely grim, man. Even reading through all this is hard to process, but it's important to lay this out clearly because this isn't rumor or speculation. This is the reality of what happened to this little girl. So I guess now the question becomes, where does that leave us? Even though information has felt scarce at times, there obviously has been movement. Witnesses are being called to appear, including his friend who was taken into custody in Montana, one of his managers as well, and even his immediate family members. And now David is officially labeled as a target in this murder investigation. At the end of the day, that is progress. And whether people realize it or not, cases like this don't just freeze. They move forward. Now that could mean charges against David, or it could mean no charges. I guess we'll see, right? But one thing is clear. This case has entered a new phase. Not the speculative phase, not the social media phase, the legal phase. And I truly hope Celeste eventually gets justice because obviously no child deserves to lose their life like this.
The fact that he's not locked up is just blowing my mind, and I feel like it's just giving him a lot of time to get away or to hide, you know? So it's just crazy that they're not moving this along quicker considering the severity of the case. But it's wild that her body was dismembered, like just parts of her body. So someone like cut her up. Like, that's so sick. So considering how extreme this is, I just would expect things to move a little quicker or just have him in custody or something. You know, it's just wild. But yeah, we will see what takes place. Hopefully charges will come about soon. Y'all let me know what y'all think, and I'll see y'all on the next one. Bye.